Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Catherine. I'm sure some of you are probably listening to my bio and thinking, she does animal welfare work. Why is she talking to us about statistics? And does she actually have much reason to be talking to us about that? Well, hopefully we can go through some options of abilities to really try to improve reproducibility and translation through the statistical practices that we're doing that really aren't hard to implement. So really is pretty basic things to be thinking about when you're working on your science. But honestly, I feel like statistics is really more of a tool than I think we often give it credit for. And so thinking about how you can utilize that tool in really powerful ways is really important. So hopefully we can go through some of those ideas, and I can hopefully keep your attention. As Catherine said, this can sometimes be a hard topic to talk about and keep people awake, but I will do my best. So before we get started, I just want to kind of put out a quick disclosure. This talk is actually based on the work I completed while at Purdue University and does not necessarily reflect the opinions or ideas or beliefs of my new employer, Novartis. So just wanted to put that out there. But this does reflect the opinions of my partner in crime, Dr. Joseph Garner. And a lot of this information that I'm going to be talking about today actually was in kind of the basis of a 2020 paper that he and I wrote together. And really kind of nothing in it is new or revolutionary, but the idea of hopefully providing some of these ideas in a way that's approachable to somebody who is not a statistician or might actually be a little afraid of statistics. So these are some ideas that Joe and I put together for this paper, but a lot of these slides are from a presentation he and I gave that same year to really kind of talk about and provide some practical best practices to people in a presentation that we gave together. So he was very much a part of a lot of these ideas. So I want to make sure to credit him as well. So let's get started. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start with a take-home message. And really, it's all about well-designed experiments really should be encompassing the maximization of benefits, which are ways that we can ensure reproducibility and translatability, but while also balancing this with minimizing costs and making sure that the animals that we're using this research with receive the best possible well-being. And I don't necessarily think that those two things are at odds with one another. And I actually think that they combine in a way that's really powerful. And this is actually a topic that, again, myself, Dr. Joseph Garner, as well as some other fantastic colleagues, put forward in a paper on therioepistemology, which is basically the science of taking information from animals. And so really how we can balance these two things and that they can fit together in order to really maximize the information that we gather from animals. But really we should be kind of switching the script a little bit and thinking about how we can treat animals as patients and not necessarily tools. So an animal experiment really should have similarities to and match a lot of different aspects in human experimentation. So thinking about the measures, the treatments, the delivery, the environment, the subjects, all of these basic topics should really look very similar. And in my opinion, may be some of the reasons why we're seeing these challenges with translation. We're measuring body weight loss in a respiratory disease, but yet when people go into the clinic, they're looking at expiration rate and things like that. So we're not measuring the same thing. So it's not really surprising that we're having these challenges. But anyways, the focus of this talk is really to talk about experimental design, power of research projects, and analysis, and how these pieces really fit into this strategy. So I'll take a minute and really try to set the stage as to what the problem is. And I'm sure many of you have heard issues with reproducibility, with translation-related issues in our drug discovery process. And so how is this necessarily a problem or not? And so in the literature, we can look and ask the question, what is the chance that an animal study will result in some type of successful human drug? Well, in terms of replication, the data says that this can fluctuate anywhere from 10 to 50% success rate. 10 being the the worst case scenario, perhaps, and 50% being the best case scenario. But not only is this an issue of replication, but reproducibility really has a large economic cost to our ability to bring drugs to market. And so there was a paper that you see featured here that really illustrates that approximately $28 billion a year in the United States can be credited to issues with reproducibility. That is the cost of reproducibility in the United States, which is a pretty substantial amount of money. But when we're thinking a little bit more in terms of translation, so if we're thinking about the drug pipeline, so we've got the discovery phase into the preclinical phase and then into human trials. And roughly when we look at just success rate of compounds in that preclinical phase, roughly 35% make it to human trials. So it's not fantastic, but it is what it is. However, if we think about once we get those drugs into those phase 1 human trials, what is the chance that they actually make it to market? And this is where it gets pretty scary. So on average, this can fluctuate anywhere from 3 to 20% success rate in human trials. And on average, that's around 10%. We know that we can see on this figure from Kola et al. That is a data set from the FDA. It's relatively old. I think it's from 2004, but it's really sustained the test of time, and it really helps in terms of simplicity of being able to answer these questions. That we have various areas of drug research that have various levels of success rate. As you can see here, cardiovascular drugs have the highest success rate, and actually now vaccines are probably performing at this or perhaps a little bit better. And roughly 20 to 50% of these failures are simply due to human toxicology or other non-animal sources of failure. So when you calculate this out, anywhere between 50 to 80% is due to a lack of insufficient efficacy. And really, this is an estimation for the lack of translation. So that's pretty scary. And so let's take a little bit of an example here, looking at 2 different areas of research and kind of getting an understanding of how these false positive rates might be happening. Well, we've got one study here that was looking at and was a review over 200 plus studies looking at Alzheimer's disease, and not a single drug in these positive reports in the journal were actually translated into some successful application or drug into humans. So that's pretty scary as well. Now you may be thinking, well, central nervous system related diseases, those are very complex. Maybe we just don't have a good enough understanding of how those actually work. And so that's what's leading to this complication and this last lack of translation. But if we compare this to the second paper that I have here, which is a review of 500 plus stroke studies. They only found that 2 out of 500 were successful in taking to humans and being translated to humans. And in fact, one of those was already in use in humans. So ultimately, what we take from this is that there's a very low translation rate across various areas of disease research. So, we may want to think about this in terms of, all right, well, things aren't great. So if we wanted to successfully bring a drug to trial, how many actual animal studies would we need to conduct to statistically make sure that we actually got one drug to trial? And so Dr. Garner actually crunched these numbers and put this together in a really nice way. It's kind of looking at the gambit of some of that data that's coming from some of these, resource literature, and kind of translating that into, well, how many animals or how many studies would we really need to conduct in order to find drugs that are worthwhile? And so let's start off with this first scenario, where we have the real world worst case scenario. Remember that 10% reproducibility rate that was cited in one of those papers. And if we kind of go through and calculate this out, we would need 947 studies in order to bring one drug to humans. So this could be perhaps in cancer or something like that, but essentially adding in all these different sources of failure, we would need 900 plus studies in order to make sure that we could bring one drug to market. Now, if we compare this to on average, right? So the average reproducibility rate, we see that this is a little bit better. And regardless of the therapeutic area, we would still need about 86 animal projects in order to bring one drug to market. Now, if we compare that to our best case scenario, real world base case scenario from the literature of a 50% reproducibility rate, we see that we would probably need about 28 studies. So we can see that this is definitely getting better, something that's more acceptable or practical in terms of the work that we need to do. However, in general, if we put these numbers in context, we actually know what the answer is to make something more reproducible or translatable. So please don't panic. Our hair is not on fire. We actually have some really good ideas of how to do a better job. And there are actually ways of testing these ideas as well. So if we go back to our little scenario here, and let's just assume there are absolutely no animal errors. It's the absolute best case scenario. We have 100% reproducibility. So if we knew that every animal study would be reproducible and translated, we would still have failures due to other related reasons, but essentially we would only need 4 projects in order to bring that one drug to market. So this is obviously, in a perfect world, this is what we would need to do. But what about what is practical or acceptable or reasonable? So if we think about really how we're supposed to be designing our studies, is that we usually say, we're going to power this study to 80% power. Well, what that means is it's actually making a direct statement about the reproducibility rate of that study. So if we power a study to 80%, that means that it's reproducible 80% of the time. So if this were the case, and we have this beautifully designed study based on our specifications, of course, there's going to, again, be some other factors that are going to cause issues with success rate, but we would only need 7 animal-related projects to bring one drug to market. So this is orders of magnitude better than our real-world case scenario, where we were calculating approximately 28. And comparing that to our worst case scenario of over 900 studies. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into the pipeline and how all of this works. So we know that attrition is 75% of the $2 billion that it costs to bring a drug to market. However, only 3% of this cost is actually due to preclinical animal work. And that's obviously not that much money. So you may be thinking, well, if we really change this up, is that really going to be saving us that much money? Now, I make this point for a reason, and I'm emphasizing it because this is where the animal welfare related issues are. As you can see, we use various amounts of animals based on different stages of this preclinical work. But really, many have argued that you may not necessarily have to stop attrition, but you can mitigate the cost from that attrition in terms of, and as well as animal welfare, as well as finances of drug discovery by failing drugs as often, early, and fast as possible. So if we could stop drugs in this stage before we get to that peak of animal use, as well as the downstream stages of taking them into human clinical trials where those vast amounts of cost costs are, we can really make a difference. Now, we have plenty of candidates to start this process well, and that's not the problem. The problem is with specificity. So essentially, we're taking drugs into human trials that should have never been there in the first place. We're not failing drugs quickly or as readily as we probably should. So if we translate this really means that good science is actually good business, which is actually also good welfare and is good public health. So that's a wonderful idea, Brianna, but how do we actually get there? That seems like an insurmountable task and challenge. Like, how do we even approach solving this problem? Well, there's actually a lot of literature out there giving us some ideas. And a lot of papers have been talking about this for quite some time. In fact, this has become a big topic, especially in the United States. The NIH last summer came out with a white paper really focusing a lot of strategies of looking at and improving the statistics and experimental design of the work that we're doing here in the United States. So this is a topic that's starting to gain traction, even though there have been voices out in the wilderness trying to call for this. For some time. We're starting to see some momentum, especially with the government agencies here in the United States, really starting to think about and maybe hopefully put some support and resources behind making these changes. So in this emerging literature, it's really interesting. So there's all this literature, and it's from a lot of people from very diverse areas of research that weren't necessarily talking to each other. But really the common theme, which is interesting, is that all of these folks were struggling with some area of their research. And so they weren't necessarily speaking with another, but they came to a lot of very similar conclusions across these fields. And one of the first things that they concluded is that a lot of the reasons that we're seeing issues is that we've chosen to ignore something important as a consequence of something we've decided to control. And this is actually a topic that myself and others brought up with the theoreoepistemology paper. For instance, you may be doing work only in males in this early stage discovery, and you have no data in females, even though the disease itself affects both sexes. And we've actually seen this come up a lot lately in the literature as well, that there's a lot of understanding that men and women metabolize drugs differently. And there's not enough data on both sexes to really best inform how we provide those drugs to both sexes and how that may be important to focus on. But on top of this, we may be doing studies in one particular cage type or bedding, or we overly standardize the environment, which leads to poor translation. And it doesn't help us really understand how this information can then be translated to the larger population. So really, we're risking external validity. And this is a point that was made by Hanno Verbel in his standardization fallacy paper back in 2000. So he has been, trying to modernly bring up this topic to really try to get people to rethink how we're doing animal experimentation. But the second issue is that we often think of animals as patients. We don't often think of animals as patients, but we think about them as tools. And so thinking about and kind of back translating the way that we do research in human studies and really trying to apply that in our animal-based studies. So, okay, sure, that sounds great. How can I do this practically in my studies? What are some easy implementable solutions that you can take away from some of these ideas? Well, actually, again, we have a really good idea of how to make studies more reproducible. So we can look back at this work from Begley. He was actually a man who worked at a pharmaceutical company where his job was to onboard compounds out of academia. And the first thing that he would do is try to reproduce those studies that were critical in helping convince the company that this was a compound of interest. And he was only ever able to reproduce 10% of those studies. But because he actually had access to the original data, he could accurately predict which experiments would be reproduced within his lab and which couldn't. And so he kind of came up with these 6 red flags that you should be thinking about when looking at studies and really trying to understand whether they will translate or be reproduced. So the first one that he really kind of focused on was whether experiments were blinded. So this was obviously something that's a very basic scientific process, but maybe we don't do as well as we should. And this was actually something that Kilkenny and all followed up on, and they looked at and found that 14% of studies in top tier journals had no indication of blinding, which obviously is not something that's a really great practice. And in fact, Begley didn't necessarily talk about randomization, which I have here, but they found in Kilkenny that this is only done about 13% of the time in the studies that they looked at in top tier journals. So really, blinding and randomization are not new. They're very basic, good scientific practices that we should really be thinking about and implementing into our work. And so essentially what this is saying is that these basic, simple steps are not being followed. So we have other aspects such as whether the experiments were already repeated within the same lab, was all of the data presented, did they have the right positive or negative controls, were reagents validated, but then there's also this last one, were the right statistical tests applied? And so he would look at this and try to evaluate whether that was accurately or appropriately done. Well, we have some additional work that can help back up this statement. So this study conducted by Neuenhuis found that when looking at publication from the top 5 neuroscience journals, that the an error rate was committed up to 50% of the time when it came to statistical tests. Now, this might be kind of it may be much lower than this 50%. But another study put out by Nature Medicine, they hired a statistician to look at an entire year of publications in their journal and found that 38% of articles had an obvious statistical mistake. So we can see that this can vary anywhere from 0 to 50% of the publications that are out in the literature. So this could potentially be a real problem. Now, if you kind of take a step back and look at these red flags that Begley set out for us, you can see that 5 out of 6 of these are all related to experimental design and statistical issues. So these are probably things we should be thinking about and maybe spending a little bit more time thinking through and planning in our experiments. So how do we implement what Begley is trying to teach us? How can we implement what we've learned here? Well, this brings us to our second take-home message. Don't blame the animal model for a poorly designed experiment. So essentially, don't blame the animal for trying to tell us that there's something going on in its environment that might be stressful and leading to these alterations. And this is actually a point that R.A. Fisher, who is considered the father of modern biostatistics, in 1935 tried to tell us that if there are bad experimental designs in humans, it's going to be a same bad experimental design in animals. So really trying to think about how we're thinking through these designs and whether this is something that would be acceptable in some type of human trial. So if we think about human trials, really, they want to, well, in animals, we try to really control variability, but in human trials, we embrace and study that individual variability. And this is, again, a point made by Dr. Hanno-Verbel in his standardization fallacy paper, that we're really sacrificing this external validity. So to kind of make my point here, here's an example of a study we might do with humans where we have these matched pairs. Now, it could be a variety of things. It could be sex. It could be socioeconomic class. It could be stages of disease. It could be any variety. But as you can see, we've sampled clear across the United States and lots of random places, but we had these matched pairs. Now, if we compare that to the way that we do research in animals, it would look a little bit more something like this, where we're doing research on, newly sexually mature males who all live in the same neighborhood, who all eat the same food, who all live in the same type of house, who all have the same grandfather. And not only that, but they're taken care of by a Tyrannosaurus Rex that causes them constant stress on a weekly basis. And all of their social contacts are wiped every single week. So if we think about it and compare it like this, that just seems absolutely ludicrous in the type of study that we would be doing in animals. But this is very common to the way that we would do things for animal studies. And what we find that if we do embrace this variability, or if we try to assume that variability is unimportant, we see that this leads to a false discovery rate that's larger than chance alone. However, if we embrace variability by using controlled heterogeneity, this can help reduce the percent of false positives, which has been demonstrated by Richter et al. In this particular paper. So how can we both control and embrace variability? This probably is blowing a lot of people's minds. I've been trained to control things so that I can figure out what's actually happening. Well, that's not necessarily the bad part of what we're doing, but really what we're doing is we're trying to control too much, and that we need to embrace this variability and really try to merge the best controlled animal experiments with the best real world and sometimes human experimental designs. So, doesn't all of this increased variability really increase noise? Like, again, that's just really hard and kind of counterintuitive to a lot of the way that people have been trained scientifically. But really what we need to do is think about power and sample size and how these things are intertwined. Well, power is the chance that assuming there is an effect, that our experiment will find it. So really, power is just a function of signal to noise. So if we have a lot of noise, it's hard to identify that signal. But we can increase the ability to view those signals by increasing sample size. But the thing that's interesting and not a lot of people appreciate is that signal and noise increase and decrease at different rates. So noise decreases to a stable value very, very quickly and can only be further reduced by good experimental design. So any signal will become big enough and to a significant degree, but it may require thousands and thousands of data points or animals in order to get there. And so it really comes down to whether that is ethically appropriate or not, or whether we really care about something that's so small for us to find, if that's something really worthwhile. So essentially, increasing sample size is really a brute force approach to amplifying that signal. So what we need to think about is how we can improve that experimental design, because that's really the smart approach, not that brute force approach. So, okay, so let's have a think through a scenario here. And I've got a sample data set that was made up. I've kind of modeled, and we're going to analyze it a couple different ways. And hopefully this will help you understand how design and tests, statistical tests, really make all of the difference. So in this fake, study, we've got two main things that we're interested in: drug and placebo, whatever those are. And within each of these groups, we've got males and females in both, and we have 20 animals. So altogether, we have a total of 80 animals that are being used in this study, okay? But interestingly, our N of 20, which is little n, so if you see a difference there, that actually is meaningful. Big N means the total number of data points. The little n means the smallest combination. So here we have 20 replicates per combination of drug and sex. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to analyze this with the most basic test that we can do, a t-test. So in a t-test, really all we can test is whether our drug is different than our placebo. And so here we have that. I've run the drug, and we see that our term of treatment is not significant. So our p-value is 0.12. So we don't find any difference here. So we also look at some other aspects of our analysis to really kind of get an idea of how much of the variability in our data is being explained. And that's something like R-squared that you can look at. So really it just tells us of our one aspect of drug in our model, how much of the variability is explained by that term. And this is pretty bad. So it's really only about 3%, and that's pretty low. So we might sit there and think, okay, well, our study wasn't significant or was successful. How many animals would we really have need in order to reach 80% power? Now, one thing I want to put out here very quickly is that you shouldn't solve power retrospectively. So we would calculate this and see how much power we actually achieved. But we're kind of flipping this and doing this kind of the right way to ask, well, how many animals should we have needed if we were to have restarted the study all over again to consider, and then we can consider whether that number was something that we're willing to work with or not. And so if we do this, we find that in order to achieve 80% power, we would have needed 260 to 280 animals. But we only used 80 in this experiment, and that does seem like quite a few animals for a single experiment. So, okay, we realized, oh, actually, we had drug, but we also had both sexes. So maybe we should include that in a two-way ANOVA so we can see if something along those lines like sex was affecting some of our data variability. And again, no, it's not. We see a small little improvement in the p-value of the thing we're really interested in, drug. It's increased to 0.13, but it's still not significant. We take a look at our R-squared, and this is a little bit better, but it's still really, really bad. So again, we ask the question, how many of animals would we have needed? And we see that this really hasn't changed. We still need 260 to 280 animals. So you go back to the drawing board and you're trying to think through, well, what was a better, smarter experimental design to perhaps run with this? And this is something that you come across as a split plot design. Now, split plot designs are actually more common than you would expect, and they can help us really deal with real world issues. So let's say you have a factor that you want to study, but you really can't change it like you can other factors. And this is something that really had its roots, pun intended, in agriculture, where you might have a plot of land that you want to do a research study on, looking at 2 different fertilizers and 4 different seed varieties. But the thing that's interesting about this plot of land is that one side actually gets more sun and the other side is a little bit wetter, because let's say that it's close to a river or stream. And so really the experience that the plant has on one side is going to be very different than the other. So you could set up a study kind of like this, where you can really only apply your fertilizer to large tracts of land. So you could set up fertilizer A on top and fertilizer B on bottom. But as I said, one of the issues that you've got here is that now fertilizer A is confounded with extreme sunlight and fertilizer B is confounded with wetness. So you probably want to set it up something like this so you can see how additional sun and additional moisture may affect both fertilizer A and B. So now you're saying, okay, well, now we need to apply our different seeds. And again, we can only really apply them to larger sects of land. So we'd use a random number generator to figure out, the order in which subplots we put the seeds in both sections. And so this is how we might approach this. So how does this actually apply to animals? So again, thinking through this, split plot, which factor is the one that we really can't change easily? Well, we can easily assign drug or placebo to any animal. So it's probably sex. So sex is something that's very difficult for us to change, right? So if we think through our experiment, so sex becomes our top layer. And our between subject layer is in which the effect of being male or female, or the sex effect, is tested with respect to variation from subject to subject. So we have 20 male cages in blue and 20 female cages in pink, and we're going to put 2 mice per cage. We would want to make sure that we put 1 drug and 1 placebo treatment in each of those cages. Now, also pay attention, the animal on top is the one who gets the injection first, and we'd want to balance which mouse in the cage gets the treatment first, because maybe there's some effect or stress related to being the second animal that's being taken out of the cage. There's some anticipation related stress that might interfere. So we'd want to try to balance that across our cages. Now, we wouldn't necessarily want to set up our cages this way where we have all males on one side and all our females on the other of a rack. We want to set it up something like this in a checkerboard so that we can vary any related variability across the rack to all of our treatments. Now, one of the things that the reason we want to think about this is that we know that, so here we have our little checkerboard, we know that row height can contribute to stress in our laboratory animals. So whether it's lighting, visibility, vibration, it doesn't matter what it actually is, but we know this phenomenon exists and we consistently see it. So what about other things that are going on throughout the room? We see that there could be increased, exposure and traffic to animals that are on the outside of the rack compared to the ones who are closer to the wall. So we see that we could have variability in the animal experience from top to bottom and left to right. So that's why we really want to try to balance this across these factors. And again, it doesn't matter what it is, as long as we affect both treatments equally. So let's go back to our split plot design. We have considered cage as our subplot and our blocking factor. And so when we do this, we only assign sex to a cage. So you can only have 1 sex in a cage. And the way we call this statistically is that we nest cage within sex. And so if we put this into our model, you can see we have our new cage variable here that really is telling us here that there's a lot of variability between cages within sex. So this could indicate that any variability that falls on the cage level. So cages at the top of the rack might experience maybe more stress than the ones at the bottom, but it doesn't matter because it's all being controlled for here with this term of cage nested within sex. And what do we see in terms of our R squared? Wow, it has skyrocketed to 96%, which I think many of us would be more than happy to see. And as you can see in our model to the left, our drug is now significant. So again, we might ask, well, how many animals would we have needed to compare with some of the other analyses we've done? And this one says we needed 44 to 48 animals in order to achieve 80% power. So, but we forgot that, maybe we're interested in the males and females and how our drug may actually interact differently. So we know that drugs are metabolized differently between males and females. This is probably something we should be looking at. So again, we add in our interaction term, which you see at the bottom there, drug times sex. And this shows us that it was significant. And ultimately what we find is that there's no difference in males, but there is in females. So perhaps our drug interacts with estrogen, altering whatever outcome variable we might be measuring. We see that, our R squared is increased a little bit, but it's still exceptionally good. And again, if we ask, how many animals would we have needed? And we see that we would have needed 44 to 48 again. So wonderful. But how should we have proactively evaluated sample size and calculated that? Well, unfortunately, calculating power for factorial designs, which this study was, so we had a factorial a 2x2 factorial of drug by sex. And this can be really complicated to calculate, which is why people traditionally use the simple power calculations. However, those are really designed for t-tests, which hopefully very few of us are actually utilizing nowadays. So there's something called Mead's resource equation, and it's really easy to apply. Now, the basic concept is that you're calculating the number of degrees of freedom, which we'll go over in a second if you're not familiar with what that means, for the F-test that you would have in some type of ANOVA. All right, so the point is that you want to shoot for your error term, so the what's left over, to be between 10 and 20. And in our paper, we call this the Price is Right rule. So if you're from the United States, a game show where it's the closest without going over. And so I found that quite amusing to try to call that the Price is Right rule. But really what we're trying to do is get as close to 20 degrees of freedom in our error term without going over. Because if we go over, it means that we are potentially wasting animals. So essentially how we do this, we take the total number of degrees from our statistical model plus our error, and that's the total number of degrees of freedom from your animals, perhaps like in this experiment, number of degrees of freedom. And so but we're really curious about the error term. So if we just kind of rearrange this, it's the total degrees of freedom minus the number in our model. So let's go through this with our example. So let's calculate the number of degrees of freedom for the total number. And basically that's the number of data points that you have, or mice. So in this example, it could be cages. It really depends on what your experimental unit is. But in this experiment, it's 80 mice. So we take 80 minus 1, and that gives us, and that's how you always calculate degrees of freedom. So you take 1 away. And so we'd have a total of 79 degrees of freedom. So let's look at our model next and calculate that. So to calculate our blocking factor of cage nested within sex, basically what you do is you take the number of cages, which was 40 in this experiment, and then you take 2 away for the number of levels of sex, which is the thing that's nested in there. And so we have a total of 38 degrees of freedom that requires. To calculate sex, very simple. We have 2 levels. We take 1 away, so 1 degree of freedom. Same procedure for drug. And then if we look at the interaction, it's the degrees of freedom for sex times the degrees of freedom for drug. So 1 times 1 is 1. So if we add all of these up, we have the 79 total minus the 41 from our model. And so our error degrees of freedom is 38 in this original experiment. So essentially, we are overpowered. Our error term is above 20. So how could we have used Mead a priori? Well, here's our original design. Let's just say that we reduce those replications to 10 instead of 20. So we would have a total of 40 animals. So if we did that, the total number of data points would be 39. For our model, we would see that instead of 40 cages, we now have 20 because we've reduced that in half. So 20 cages minus that 2 for sex, we now have 18. Same process for sex as before, same process as drug for before. And so there you go. So really what you're seeing is that there's this difference in the model really affects cage, not really necessarily any of the other aspects within the model. So again, we do our calculation, and here we find our error degrees of freedom is 18. I think we've hit the sweet spot. We're really close to 20, but we haven't gone over. So fantastic. So let's say that with that same data set, I go through and I randomly select 20 cages. So that would be our 40 mice. And I run the same analysis, that same split plot analysis. And what we find is that we still have really strong significance, and our squared is great. And again, if we look at the number of mice we would have needed, it now says we actually could have gotten away with less. Now, this in here, case in point of why you should not do post hoc power analysis, because inherently, if you have statistical significance, you have achieved power. and that if you don't have a significant result, you have not achieved significant power. So this is why post hoc power analyses are really pointless and really shouldn't be conducted. So the key point to take away here is that we reached significance with 40 fewer mice, simply due to the way we designed and analyzed our study. So trying to wrap up here for a few things for you to watch out for as you're looking through other studies or trying to really identify how to best apply some of these aspects to your research. The first pitfall to watch out for is confounding treatment with cage and reducing the numbers of animals in cages. So as an example of this, you might put all of your drug animals in one cage and all of your drug animals in another. A better way to do this is to actually split these apart, because right now, any effects that are due to cage, which we just found out in this previous example, was causing a lot of variability. You now have that cage is confounded with your drug treatment. So how do we try to get around this? Well, we split apart our animals into smaller groups so that we can hopefully pull apart those differences or effects due to cage. So this is one way to work around that. We can split treatments across cages as well. So instead of doing something like this, where you have all of one treatment in one cage, kind of the next stage that we looked at, well, actually, it would be better if we had one drug and one placebo. So here's our split plot within each of these cages. So this is a way for us to block by cage and be able to really identify how the variability due to cage may be affecting our treatments differently. Next, confounding treatment with rack position. So randomization is key, and really trying to ideally use Latin square designs. And really what this means is playing Sudoku. So hopefully you all are familiar with the number game Sudoku, where you have every single number from 1 to 9 in each row, each column, and in each square. And so we want to try to replicate that in the way that we set up animals on our racks. So obviously this is not Sudoku, but if we do something like this, where we've got this even across top and bottom, left to right, we're better achieving that balance and randomization due to this variability. So next, failing to blind, and this could be the data collector, the person actually taking the measurements. This could be care staff. So we know that the way animals are handled and interacted with can really affect outcomes. So this is something that we try to do as well. But even if you can't blind, because in some cases there's no way that you can actually do it, we try to blind at least for what the hypothesis for our study is. And the reason why blinding is important is that we see that the effect size is inflated. And this is probably something we're not intentionally doing, but it's inflated when our groups are not blinded. And we can see that there's a difference on whether this translates to overall effect sizes in the work that we're doing. So this is really important. Number 4, not analyzing interactions properly. So remember, back in our scenario, we looked at included drug times sex. So analyzing subsequent T-tests is a real no-no. You can do all of this in one analysis, and that's the beauty of it. So watch out for anything just in general that's justified by a T-test. These were great ways of testing our data back when we had to do this by hand, but we now have really powerful computers that can do really sophisticated analyses for us. So we should really be utilizing them. So if you see something that's justified by a T-test, ask for experimental design, ask for example analyses to really get to the root of this. And number 6, I would highly recommend not using pilot experiments to justify animal numbers. And this has to do with the fact that pilots usually use too few of animals and are generally underpowered. And in order to find a result there, basically you have to, by chance, have accidentally found an effect size that's larger than actually really exists. So essentially you're setting yourself up for reproducibility failure. And eventually wasting animals' time and resources. So use Mead's equation and just do the experiment. And with that, I will wrap up. I went a little bit longer than expected, but hopefully this has generated some thoughts and ideas as I've gone through some of these topics, and would be more than happy to take some questions. So thank you.